Welcome to Rauta. This video is done in commercial collaboration with our sponsor, Steelfest. Hello and welcome to Rauta. This is the second episode of Crash Course to Norwegian black metal from the 90s. Why so specific? Well, I basically explained the reasoning to this in my previous episode, the first one, which included bands like Mayhem, Darkthrone and Burzum. The reason is this: there are way too many bands to include them all, so I decided to do this video series focusing on bands that started their careers already in the 90s, and I still could list over 50 bands to be included in this video series. This particular episode, episode number 2, includes three different bands for you to learn all about. And like the previous episode, this is not so much veterans and all seen old school people who have been through all of these bands, but maybe give some insight to younger generation or newbies to the genre to find about some basic information, some albums to check out and all that stuff when it comes to Norwegian veterans of 1990s, the so-called second wave, and especially the first few years of black metal. Now, something that I want to correct about my first video was that some people pointed out that maybe including last FM numbers in addition to other numbers about the bands and their success is, I guess, worth mentioning, because I included some of the statistics just in order to kind of give a little bit of a number game when it comes to those three different bands, which I named the essential ones: Darkthrone, Burzum, and then Mayhem, of course. And the reason is this, that a lot of these different bands obviously have a lot of following. The older you are, you're kind of bound to have more following, but of course it goes kind of hand in hand what kind of material you have out there, like how many albums and, well, how catchy, how mainstream like your niche black metal can be. And given that the Mayhem is outright the oldest of Norwegian bands, started already in the 80s doing black metal, whereas the other bands kind of was, all were in the 90s when it comes. I mean, Darkthrone, technically speaking, started in the 80s, but their black metal era very, very much on the 90s. And that numbers can kind of prove that even though Burzum is not so much present on social media for any given reasons, explained in the first episode, when it comes to last FM things, it's the second biggest from Norway. Only one that is bigger is actually Dimmu Borgir. So it was a kind of a good to point out that sometimes these number games are very different, whether you stare at Facebook or Instagram or Spotify numbers. But they all kind of add up, and we could say those three essential ones are nonetheless the most essential ones, even if Mayhem put out their debut album as late as 1994. But like I said, they had already had material out there before the albums. But now it's time to focus on these three different bands, which I would call the big ones. And I decided to call them the big ones not only because of the numbers game, because like I said, Dimmu Borgir is the biggest one of all black metal bands basically, and among the top three would be bands like Cradle of Filth and Behemoth, and they are not Norwegian, so not obviously included here. But in terms of success, Immortal and Satyricon are definitely in the top three of these bands when we're adding them to the ones that I mentioned before. Actually, Dimmu Borgir is the biggest, and then it gets a little bit more debatable whether it's Immortal on the second spot or maybe it's supposed to be Mayhem, because these numbers are a little bit different when you look at this last FM or Facebook following or whatever. But roughly Immortal and Mayhem are more or less in the same category. And then Darkthrone, Satyricon kind of on the second tier, if you will. Well, Dimmu Borgir would be the first one, and Satyricon Mayhem on the second, and maybe Darkthrone and all that stuff different. But like I said, these number games are not too specific. They are not to be taken like literally defining which one is better or bigger and all that stuff. What matters is that you need to understand how much of an impact these bands have made over the years. But this is enough of intro talk, so let's go through Immortal, starting with that one, this episode that is. And much like many other bands throughout the years, I mean, a lot of these bands are already 30 years and plus, and Immortal is one of them, being one of the oldest from Norway to do black metal. So obviously these kind of bands have different phases. Like I mentioned in my previous video, Mayhem had its own phases. Same thing with Darkthrone and Burzum. Some have more than two. Some bands just like started with certain point, changed with the second phase of the band career, and then could count like third or fourth era. Basically, we could say Immortal is one of those third era bands at this point. And curiously enough, they already have this new album, War Against All, coming out later in May 2023, which I was lucky to get to listen before making this video, so I could actually include that one as well, making comments. But what matters is more that Immortal started in 1991, and it was only like a year later when they had their first album out called Diabolical Full Moon Mysticism. And back then the band lineup was actually quite different. Obviously the main guys, Abath and Demoness, were the most defining guys because after all, the drummer of the first album, he was replaced later on and then gained different stuff, which I'm gonna address very soon. But Demoness and Abath were the main dudes who always defined what Immortal was. Until Demoness actually had some health problems and was kind of put on the side bench, so to speak, but still helping the band and defining the band. And then there was this, court action, who actually owns the right to Immortal name and all that stuff, and it gets complicated. But before we get into that, it's worth mentioning the first album, and Diabolical Full Moon Mysticism is kind of a different breed of all Immortal albums. It's very, very much like kind of a Bathory-esque thing. I mean, it's paying direct homage to what Bathory was doing already in the 80s, and Bathory is one of the best black metal bands out there, hands down. So there's no shame in that. But I think that kind of makes sense. It kind of points out, underlines the fact that Immortal wasn't exactly very genre defining with their first album. As good as the album may be, with kind of a raw end of sound and kind of a dark presence, it was kind of like Bathory band. So they were not exactly doing their own sound and style with the debut album. In my opinion, it's not the best nor it's the worst. It's kind of a middle range Immortal album in style, but it's something that is very good to understand and listen to because it's kind of one of those albums that define Norwegian sound. I mean, it came as early as 1992, and if you take a look at the number of bands from Norway, some bands were not even founded in 1992, let alone do the debut album. Burzum was one of the very few which did that, but most of the bands became a little bit later. So Immortal was one of indeed the kind of a head start bands when it comes to Norwegian black metal. Now the second album, which came only a year later, and I'm not counting months here, I'm just talking about release years because they give you roughly idea what is going on and which kind of pace. So Pure Holocaust, I think that's one of the most genre-defining albums from Norway ever. It's so grim, it's so fast, it's dark, it's just kind of a brilliant album showcasing Norwegian black metal and second wave. And that already came as early as 1993. So it's still one of those kind of a fiercest albums and also one of the first ones I got to hear around, I would say, probably late 1994. Because it was indeed one of my first Norwegian black metal albums or black metal bands ever I got to listen to. And that was the point where I just could understand and like the kind of a raspier and throatier and screamier, shrieky vocals, which was not so much like automatically happening. Me coming from more like death metal and thrash metal background, and getting into this kind of vocal representation wasn't exactly something that would obviously happen. I had hard time coming from death metal, while I could like black metal sound and production, and definitely the ideology being anti-Christian and all, and the religious, but the vocals kind of put me off for a bit. For example, bands like Marduk, I could imagine, I remember listening to Opus Nocturne album, and I was like, man, I like some of the songs, but I can't understand the vocals, except the ones that didn't have the raspier ones. So it was more like checking out the ideology, lyrics, riffs, cover arts, opinions like interviews, basically everything else but the vocals. And once I got past that last obstacle, that was like going deep and hard into black metal territory. And there you had bands like Rotting Christ, Marduk, Immortal, and some of the rest came a little bit later on. Battery was one of the first one too. So Pure Holocaust was obviously making a big impact on a younger version of myself, me being something like probably 19 years of age. And suddenly these fierce, very cold, grim Nordic riffs were like, just like, wow. Now, Battles in the North was way more chaotic compared to Pure Holocaust. I mean, it still is more chaotic and faster and crazier albums in so many ways. But at that point, I think the band kind of lost a little bit of that essence what they had with Pure Holocaust. Mind you, Pure Holocaust also has a Star Wars reference to Imperial March, which was brilliant given that these guys are barely in their 20s and they're including some of the most memorable sci-fi or, well, space opera things, one of the most known soundtrack pieces in their music, but with a black metal twist. It's brilliant. You can't really make that shit up. It's just like, wow, listen to it. So all I'm saying is that Battles in the North, while it's a great album, it pales in comparison with Pure Holocaust because it got kind of a crazier and more chaotic, and some people would say, yeah, it's kind of a goofy also. Playing on these snow, wintery landscapes and mountains, all this stuff. But that was one of the reasons what made Immortal immortal, literally and figuratively. The thing here is, it was those days, that era when Immortal became this kind of a meme band. All gave the first reason to it, but music was good and it was kind of showcasing that these guys don't fuck around. I mean, they do proper riffs with some kind of an evil grim sound and they don't care about rules. And back then, obviously, Immortal had, inverted crosses in their logo, which was always kind of a mess, but it kind of pointed out we're doing black metal. We're anti-Christian and we're coming from Norway. If you don't like it, piss off and die. I liked it. I loved it. I still think the Pure Holocaust is the best Immortal album of all times. Why so? I recently, before this making this video, obviously, I went through the whole discography, figure out if some things had changed in my mind. But no, I still think it's the best one, and there's no change in that. Then came Blizzard Beasts, which in 1997 was kind of a weird cookie because it kind of featured some Morbid Angel homage kind of a thing, so it was kind of flirting borderline, but still with death metal. Also, it kind of showcased that Immortal was moving into different direction. So it was almost like Battles in the North was the last bastion of grim black metal thing, and Blizzard Beast were moving on. Now, obviously, I get it. After 3 albums, more or less, in the same territory, you want something different. But it was like, one way or another, it was kind of like logical continuation, a successor to Battles in the North, and on the other hand, it was exploring new territories. Curiously enough, it became the only one of this given style, if you can call it its own style. So it was more like the styles were merging. It was like the band was in transition phase and moving to something else. And then the big bomb dropped. And this is for a lot of people some of the most loved Immortal material. You can pretty much see on the scores on Metal Archives and other places, but at the Heart of Winter 1999, it was something phenomenal in a way. I remember making it big waves. People loved it. People still love it. Some people consider it the best. It was more like this epic Nordic metal, not so much anymore grim black metal. I mean, you have black metal vocals, obviously, and when it comes to these kind of a winter landscapes and all about Norwegian coldness, grimness, bluster themes and all that stuff, they are still there. But the music is more like basically the same what Bathory was doing after 3 albums. First you do the kind of a groundbreaking, genre-defining albums, old school black metal with kind of a lot of trashiness in it. Then Bloodfire Death happens, and it's suddenly something like epic transition phase from black metal towards Viking metal. Not exactly being either of these two styles, but creating something new, and then that era was gone. At the Heart of Winter was basically touching base with, Bloodfire Death kind of a thing, kind of clinging to black metal and kind of a moving on. And in my opinion, it finally started the so-called second era of Immortal, where Blizzard Beast was only like this transition phase album. Now, personally, I still don't like At the Heart of Winter not that much anymore. I mean, I liked it when it came out. It felt fresh and something new. So in a way, it's kind of time capsule album in that sense. But I got kind of bored to it, and I thought maybe things would be different now that I've been listening to it. But no, I still feel like it's kind of a good album, but not beyond 7.5 for me anyway, out of scale from 1 to 10. Roughly the same thing which I would say about Blizzard Beasts. They are just too different, so kind of hard to compare, but at the same time, in quality wise, yeah, I mean, it's good, but it's not like pure Holocaust good. So good and great. There's a difference. And with that epic style, that's pretty much that kind of cemented the whole style with, what Immortal would be for coming years. That was already, 1999. So over 20 years later, things are not that different. Not with the Abbath's solo career, which he started to do after getting into feud with Demonas and things going south, but also what Immortal is nowadays doing. The epic level of black metal, which is, I guess, more Nordic metal. Some people would just joke about it being weather metal because about singing about winter and winter landscapes and snowing and icicles and all that stuff. But like I said, Immortal has always been that. And if you're looking for satanic themes or deeply ideologically loaded themes, Immortal is not for you. But that's a different story. Now, after the Heart of Winter came Down in Black, which in my opinion is the weakest of all Immortal albums. Basically, it's the same style, and now with a new lineup. I mean, with Blizzard Beasts, they already brought Hork, also famous for Hypocrisy. He played drums, and obviously he's way better with drums than what Abbott was doing with Battles in the North. So he kind of added a new level to the talent of the band. But in my opinion, like I said, the style changed too much. And the grimness of black metal was like gone out of the window, and there was this new band. Now with Down in Black, there was also a new member in the band. So band was kind of expanding and becoming bigger, and everything seemed to like, okay, Immortal is going to take the world and all that stuff. But at the same time, I feel they kind of lost something magical. It's not a bad album. It's actually a decent one, but in terms of Immortal discography, I find it the weakest. It's somehow like a lukewarm version of what At the Heart of Winter is. Not the big difference, but still. Somehow it kind of let down. The band, however, fixed its course, and 2 years later when Sons of Northern Darkness came, it was, in my opinion, a lot better. Maybe now, in hindsight, Damned in Black is weak because it came only 1 year after At the Heart of Winter. So maybe there wasn't enough time to just, fix and polish the material, but more like let's just quickly run it through and put it out. I don't know. This is speculation. Something had changed, and Sons of Northern Darkness kind of fixed it. 7 years later, All Shall Fall came out. And this is one of those turning points. Now if you take a look the lineup here, you will have 4 members, but not the same ones that were in the band back then. And this was also the last one with a bath. So this is the period when things went really weird, and I still don't know to this day. Nobody has openly said, maybe it's not even public. Probably a lot of people do. I don't, and that kind of goes beyond the scope of this video anyway, is that this 9 years difference here. This is the one that kind of defined Immortal more ways than other. Take a look at the lineup. Only Demonas and Horg left. And this, in a way, kind of started the third era of Immortal. Demonas and Abath were no more good best buddies in the band. And I felt kind of weird when the band had their court action about the name, who owns the right, and all that stuff, because Demonas was on the bench for health reasons. His hands or wrists were not, just in shape in order to play the guitar, whatever the real case was. Abath, however, and the rest of the lads kept touring and doing music. Yet he lost the rights to the music. Now, there might be some legal issues which define this, but it felt weird that you're the kind of a guy who kept the band going on, and you still kind of lose it to the other guy of the band while you kept it afloat. But I don't touch the legal issues. Once again, goes beyond the scope of this video, but it's interesting how it went. And suddenly Abath was like, okay, fuck it, I'm gonna run my own band, Abath. Now, with 3 albums later, it was clear that he could keep Immortal afloat with a different name, so all things are good now. I mean, we have, instead of one Immortal, we basically have 2 bands, Abath and Immortal, both roughly doing the same kind of music. So in the end, I guess, from the audience point of view, I think we won. For the band members, I hope that they will make amends and become friends once again, but I think from the audience and music fan point of view, this is better for us. Instead of just one band, we have two good bands. Because in my opinion, Abath has done three good albums. And I could say the same about Immortal after that, except the exception of two bands. I mean, two albums. Because Northern Chaos God was suddenly, in my opinion, heading the right direction, suddenly improving the Immortal thing, making maybe the best album since At the Heart of Winter. Not maybe necessarily better, but still. And the last track, for example, is a good homage once again to Bathory with its kind of epic level of black metal things, or blast herc metal, whatever you want to call it. And now 2023 is the time for the second Demoness-driven Immortal album, War Against All, which in my opinion is even better than Northern Chaos God. The review is already out, was released earlier this week, supposedly the same week that I'm doing this video. So you can get the review out there, but I think it's heading in the right direction. The only thing which is worse in my opinion compared to Abath ones is that the vocals are not that good. But all that put aside, War Against All might be actually the best Immortal album since Battles in the North. So if you really put everything summing up here, I would say Immortal never made a weak album. When they were weakest with Damned in Black, roughly 7 out of 10 for me, it kind of points out that this band was more consistent in style and quality rather than a lot of those bands. If you watched the previous episode, you might remember that I said a lot of Norwegian bands started to go south between 1996 and 1998. That kind of holds true with Blizzard Beast as well, but not so much like losing quality, just changing style. And Immortal is, in my opinion, one of the winners of that given era, because where other bands started to go way weirder and losing their magical touch after the first few albums, Immortal just changed the style and somehow managed to do good stuff. Yet not as good as Pure Holocaust, so maybe in that sense there's a little bit point to that, but that's just my opinion. But this all, lots of touring, lots of albums, lots of good albums mind you, helped make Immortal one of the biggest black metal bands out there. So now it's curious to see how it will fold out after Immortal is now officially only one-man band anymore. Demoness is taking care of everything, and there was no even information who is the session drummer, not to mention possible other crew in the band. So it's going to be interesting to see how Immortal's later career will fold out, but we shall see. It's going to be interesting, and let's hope we get to see the band in some way or another live. Satyricon, then again, is also one of those oldest bands from Norway, but this is even more curious because, first of all, it wasn't even founded by Frost and Satyr, which are the known members of the band. And while the band was founded roughly around the same era than as Immortal, 1990, but their first demo came out in 1992. And if you take a look at this members list and look at the past members, you will find out that these past members were in the band before, Satyr and Frost joined. There's not saying dates here, but the point is, unlike some people seem to think, it's not founded by those two guys. However, they are the ones who just, made the band what it is. So, of course, they are supposed to give in credit for what they have been doing with Satyricon, now also more than 30 years in the business. Now, since I went through Satyricon discography more in detail a few years ago with one of my videos, I'm just gonna do more quick recap with this one rather than going like Immortal. But it's worth mentioning that Dark Medieval Times 1993 was also in a way groundbreaking album. First of all, it was more folkier than say Immortal or Burzum, Mayhem, all that stuff, and more experimental. I mean, there are lots of different styles put into one album, and it was kind of a weird, having lots of synths, folkier parts, also clean vocals. And still to this day, I think the album is very, very fascinating, even if not quality-wise as good as the albums that would come afterwards. But Dark Medieval Times is definitely a special case, and it also features very interesting drum patterns, one of the most creative ones by Frost ever, which I think is one of the key elements of all Norwegian black metal. We'll get back to that in later episodes as well. Now, Shadow Throne is, in my opinion, that more or less cemented like Satyricon's understanding of quality, good songwriting, grim sound, evil sound and all that stuff. And also, I gotta say, Satyr himself is one of my favorite black metal vocalists, with his very, very strong and evil vocal style. I just can't get enough too much of it. The only one probably I would put ahead of him would be Nocturno Culto of Darkthrone, but roughly in the same level as Weakness of Version, just with different style. Satyr is magnificent vocalist, or at least used to be, especially the early albums. Wow. Now, Shadow Throne is even better than Dark Medieval Times, and for many, many years I thought it was the best Satyricon album. But later years, especially with my latest discography run with the whole band, I still have to go with Nemesis Divina. So I guess I'm back to the more mainstream take on the quality, because Nemesis Divina, even if towards the end kind of gets on decline moments, the first few tracks are just magnificent. And no matter it's, I mean, no wonder it's considered one of the best, the kind of a jewel moments of Norwegian black metal from 1990s. And maybe it helped that there was a little bit more time between Shadow Throne and Nemesis Divina versus the two first ones. But then it gives this bad moment. Remember when I said between 1996 and 1998, a lot of Norwegian bands started to go decline. This is exactly the same thing. Suddenly, with the famous and success and all that stuff, after Nemesis Divina, Satyricon changed direction, turning more than 90 degrees. Suddenly, they become this more industrial sound, maybe like the so-called Matrix era with Rebel Extravaganza. Don't get me wrong, it's actually pretty good of an album with very cold and very different atmosphere than the previous ones, but it also meant that losing a lot of fan base. Probably brought in a lot of fans as well, but a lot of people just don't like that style anymore and cling to the three first albums by Satyricon. That was soon followed by Volcano, soon meaning 3 years later. In my opinion, Volcano more like perfected the style what Rebel Extravaganza was doing, but some people just disagree. I think Volcano is more hit oriented, if you will, and overall I think it's a little bit better album. But of course, this is up for debate. And also, Volcano, in my opinion, marks the last good Satyricon album. And that after that, it became steadily going to decline. Now, Diabolical 4 years later was a mere shadow of what Satyricon was doing earlier on. And mind you, there has been different members throughout the bands as well. So it's like Satyricon has always been just these two guys. For example, Nemesis Divina, you had, for example, Dark Throne guy, Nocturnal Culto taking part. Even Emperor guy, someone was part of the band at some point. So one starts to wonder, maybe the band was at their best, at their peak moments, because there were more than two guys. One can only wonder how it would have been differently. Anyhow, though Diabolical was a step down. The Age of Nero was also a step down from that. And then came Satyricon, and it was a slippery slope. Deep calleth upon deep, being the weakest of all Satyricon albums. So mind you, the more they spend time with between different albums, touring mayhaps and just, I don't know, experimenting with the music, the down it goes. Now, it was only this year when I got to listen to Satyricon and Munch, the kind of a non-metallic tribute or homage album to the famous painter from Norway, whose art was also used for Deep Call It Upon Deep. That is not a metal album. That's actually interesting soundscape album, but has very, very little to do with anything that Satyricon made up until that far. And now I just don't have my hopes high up for Satyricon to do another great album because, like I said, it's been over 20 years since they made fantastic album. That's even more than, for Dark Throne, which in my opinion haven't been doing a really good album for still like 16 years. So, one of those bands that kind of started another era, much like those bands before, but already that in 1999 album, Rebel Extravaganza, and never looked back. Unfortunately, so because none of these albums ever since have been as innovative, even if totally different, and softer. So, people who are looking for some Norwegian 1990s tip, stick to those three first albums and you're pretty good to go. Pretty much the same thing as with Immortal. And the newest, but also the biggest of Norwegian bands featured so far in this Crash Course series is obviously Dimmu Borgir. Now they came a little bit late to the party when the band was founded as late as 1993. Even more so, For All Teeth came 1995. Quite late to the party if you really think about it, given that bands like Satyricon had like 2 albums out, almost 3, and if you take Immortal into the game, 3 albums out and all that stuff. But nonetheless, Dimmu Borgir's way softer, way more melodic, way more synth-driven music was something that there was, kind of a void to be filled with. And that's where All Teeth came in. It was kind of a folky, lots of synthesizers, kind of a moody, not my thing, mind you. I never liked it. And then Game Storm Lost, which a lot of people considered, be the best Dimmu Borgir album. For me, it was way too melodic and way too cheesy. Way more cheesy than For All Teeth. Suddenly there was a lot more synthesizers present, even less riff-driven music, and I was like, what the hell? But this I came to figure out later on because, in fact, I am one of that generation who grew up with Dimmu Borgir from Enthroned Darkness Triumphant and onwards. And that was a majestic big album when it came out. Bigger synths, way bigger sound than ever before with Norwegian black metal. And really catchy riffs, really catchy synthesizer parts, good vocals, excellent production. I sold it a few years later, becoming, more into grimness and rawness of black metal. But I still feel that this album made something magnificent and different when I was listening to this episode. And I still think it's one of their best releases ever. Maybe the second best if you ask me. And going back to those 2 albums, after that third album, it was like a big shock really. So I never got to like those 2 first albums. And I feel like I'm more allergic to Stormblast nowadays than back in the 90s when I was probably more prone to like that kind of stuff. Now, onwards from Enthroned, the Dimmu Borgir not only changed their style a little bit, but unlike other bands, they didn't go in decline with 1997, 1998 stuff. Quite the contrary, they just shifted to bigger gear with Spiritual Black Dimensions, which basically used the same pattern, but in my opinion doesn't include that good songs as Enthroned album. Same thing was with Puritanical Euphoric Misanthropia, but that one is so overly produced, it's kind of annoying to listen to. But I mean, I get it. They wanted to get bigger and they were already getting a lot of fame for their rather easy to approach kind of black metal. Lots of synthesizer, lots of melodies, still kind of a sense of danger and all that stuff. And mind you, a lot of true black metal heads decided like, Dimmu Borgir is nothing to us. It belongs to the same box with Cradle, Field and the like. We don't want to go mainstream. We want to go true, grim, raw, misanthropic and all that stuff. Well, Dimmu Borgir was like, okay, send us money. We will play shows for the big audience and grab your money if you don't want it. They went, they became the bigger, they won. Grim black metal heads might feel different, but I don't think Dimmu Borgir really cares. Death Cult Armageddon basically continued with the same path, once again, keeping to the same fan service pattern, created nothing really new, but very listenable these days. None of these albums made big impact for me. I'm just not the kind of a core audience, but I can understand what they were doing. And they were adding layers and layers and better synth players and all that stuff, big production, honing the style, polishing and blah blah blah. So all fame and that is deserved in that sense. But they also drifted away a lot far away from those bands that kind of shaped the whole genre to begin with, or the second wave of black metal. And then came this album, which probably divides a lot of opinions, Stormblast MMV, that is 2005. I like it a lot more than the original ones, so call me a heretic if you want to, but I think that's where the band actually nailed. This is one of the few reworks of an album, remakes of an album, which actually makes a lot of sense because now the band actually had the talent and the budget and the understanding how to do this kind of a synth album. But for the same reason, a lot of people don't like it as much as the original one anyway. So it's an interesting take, but not that much featuring new music. So back to new music. Insorted Diabolic 2007 continued the same pattern, not changing too much. But with that album and the album that came after that one, Abradabra, they were like losing the ball, dropping the ball, and suddenly like Dimmu Borgir lost their magic. And this is obvious, like when you take a look at the review scores, 50% on average when compared to the earlier albums. Like here, you have something like 70s to 80s or something. So suddenly people started to like dislike that. 8 years later, the band came with the 30 era concept. And this is when I say the Dimmu Borgir started the 30 era. If the second era started with Throne, Ionian has not that much to do with the previous Dimmu Borgir things. It's more like Therion and some other bands kind of created a child with. Certainly it has this Dimmu Borgir trademark synthesizer, but it's also way more kind of a big orchestra album. And in my opinion, that is the best Dimmu Borgir album. Maybe because it's so different that it doesn't really sound like a typical Dimmu Borgir album. So in my opinion, they not only shed their skin, but they also, had this moment of clarity. We need to improve. We need to do something different. We need to play something else than what we previously doing because we really can't top Enthroned Darkness Triumphant with the same patterns done all over again. And who knows what will be coming after this one. I mean, it's already 5 years, but if you really think about it, 8 years between this and that. So who knows where it will go. All I'm saying is that Dimmu Borgir is kind of the weird guy in the class. Doesn't really sound like Satyricon, Dogthrone, Burzum, Mayhem, Enslaved, Emperor, and the like. Emperor might be the closest one, obviously, which will be featured later on. But it becomes this different guy, this kind of a geeky, nerdy dude who is a lot different than the other guys in his class. And suddenly he's getting all the big scores, all the big fame, and moving to higher classes when the rest are like, so what exactly happened here? This kind of also shows that certain grimness, certain darkness, certain evilness can take you as far, live or otherwise. You don't have to do live in order to be successful. Dogthrone and Burzum proved that out. But with bands having that, like, Mayhem and Immortal, Satyricon, you're gonna get bigger than just being a bedroom band or cellar band, basement band. And meanwhile, Dimmu Borgir is almost like driving with their Ferraris, taking a look at the other guys. So, how did you feel about playing grim music? We did something else and we are successful. Bye now. You can take a look at our rear lights. And that's the story so far. But these big ones are essential, not only because of their success, but because they also made something different. And now, since we have 6 bands in, all the essential ones, all the big ones, next episode I will feature some of the runner ones, or the challengers, or the ones that got away. We'll see which bands you will find, but rest assured, they're all old ones. So let me know in the comment section what you liked about this video concept, what you like the series, or do you have something interesting, some interesting anecdotes or details to share? I know this is a long video, but glad if you made it this far. Looking forward to see you again with more videos coming your way from Crash Course in Norwegian Black Metal 1990s. Take care and off you go to listen to some of these jewels. Bye bye.